At this point, we are just after World War I, and the world has changed dramatically. But before we go any further, so at this point, try to focus. We started, okay, I take Rome as the center of the world, of course, but you can take London if you want, or Paris or whatever. So we started with Egypt and Mesopotamia, east. Then Greece, east. The Arabs, east. Christianity, Judaism, east. And of course, India, China. So for a long time, the history of civilization, the big history of civilization, was east. Alexander didn't even think about going west. For him, conquering the world was going east and south to Egypt. So for a long time, it was obvious that the power, the wealth, the philosophy, astronomy was east. Okay, the Roman Empire, when they split eastern and western, the eastern one was rich. Where did Constantine put his capital? Byzantium. There was all the way east. But guess what? We got to the point, at this point, the West has colonized 80-something% of the world. Britain, huge empire. France, big empire. How did that happen? You know, suddenly you realize the West is ruling the world. But those people, the Germans, the French, and the British were the barbarians of the Romans. And those are the people who rule the world. So it's interesting at this point to stop and try to think, so what was the big advantage that the West had? Okay? And we'll discuss some pros and some cons. Right? And there's no easy solution, you know, there's no easy answer. So one thing we've seen that the West went through a number of revolutions. First, at the end of the Middle Ages, for a long time this was underestimated. Those Italian city-states, and in the north to some extent the Dutch and the German city-states, they restarted trade. And by doing trade, they got pretty wealthy. They live in an age of endemic warfare and invasions and eventually the plague and so on and so forth. But those city-states, think of Florence and Venice, today you go as a tourist, you can tell by yourself how wealthy they were. So something happened then. And there was a first industrial revolution back then, you know, the windmills or the reading glasses. These kind of things appear back then, and they signal that they are trying to harvest the power of nature to do something, that they are trying to invent things to extend the productive life of ordinary people. So something already happened there. Then you have the Industrial Revolution, of course, in Britain. Then you have the Electrical Revolution, that was mainly Germany and Britain and United States. And then the Digital Revolution of these days. But why did this thing happen in the West? And why didn't it happen somewhere else? In places like China that had all the inventions, science, technology. China and Islam. Previous evenings, I told you, Chinese invented so many things. And a lot of what the Western knows came from the Arabs. The Arabs either kept knowledge, the Greek knowledge, or they imported it from India. The Arab numerals are actually the Hindu numerals. But China and Islam were ahead for a long time. There was no comparison. And science, in any case, yeah, the West had, Galileo, Descartes, Newton invented science, but actually for a long time, until this point, pretty much, until the Victorian age, science had virtually no influence on technology. And all the great inventors you can think of in the 19th century, they were not very fluent in science. China had invented the meritocracy. You know, if you go from the Han to the Tang to the Song, those empires become more and more educated. To be, of course, the emperor is just the son of the previous emperor, but to be at the court, to have to have power, state power, you need to be a scholar-official. That became the norm in China. And meanwhile, in the West, you have all these barons and counts and whatever fighting each other for territory, and most of them are not educated at all. So China should have been ahead, right? Science again, just focusing on science is not a good answer, because the reason Columbus went to America is not science. I have no idea how much science he had, but in those days science was not well established. And the reason the steam engine was invented was not science. It was to pump water out of coal mines. So industrialization was a consequence, not a cause. And capitalism, well, capitalism came before, actually. It starts really in the Middle Age. The Middle Ages, with the Florence and Venice, they had the first bankers, they had the first insurance companies, they had the first venture capital funding expeditions, risk expedition to China, whatever. But so it was not a consequence of the industrialization, actually. Natural resources, of course, no. Right? It's natural resources, Russia wins big time in Europe. And around the world, Africa, Latin America, there were other places that had natural resources. What natural resources did Holland have? Or Portugal? These were small countries that built empires. Holland had colonies in Latin America, Suriname, New York at one point, in Asia, Indonesia, that whole area. Portugal had Angola, Mozambique, in Africa, Brazil, in America. Which natural resources did this country have originally? Wars, colonialism, imperialism. So those are typical, well, colonialism and imperialism. The Europeans somehow got better at war, and they went out and conquered. That sort of works, except that Spain was the first one, and Spain at one point had the largest empire. And guess what happened to Spain? It got poor. Within 1 century, it got poor, and until when I was a child, Spain was still a poor country. One thing that the West had actually was Roman law. Roman law was the best law in the world, probably, in terms of being, not in terms of being good, it's morally good, but in terms of being predictable. Business people like a predictable world. Imagine if taxes were erratic. It would be very difficult for anybody to decide, do I invest or not? But if you know that taxes are 30%, you might complain every single day, but it's 30%. You can plan your life. So Roman law was predictable, and Roman law had a huge influence on Europe. Whereas in China and the Islamic world, they kept heavy, unpredictable laws based on the will of the tyrant or oligarchy that was running the country. So the West, one thing that happened in the West is that the system of arbitrary expropriation by the Lord comes and says, okay, now I need this many horses, or now I need this many men to fight a war. Very arbitrary. After the Magna Carta and some other things, it was replaced by a more or less predictable law. Of course, the counter-argument, what? Europe with laws, look at what they did around the world. Was that based on the law? And piracy was sponsored by states. So, yes and no. But anyway, taxation instead of confiscation. Property rights, they started in Britain. You know that you own a house, and that's sort of guaranteed by the state. It makes a big difference. And the states that had the best property rights system were Britain and Holland, which were leaders in the Industrial Revolution. So it was a long process, slow process, but eventually, by the 19th century, there was a system that gave capitalists confidence in the system. And only at that point you can have large enterprises. So that's one advantage that the West had. Another advantage was this one. Usury was actually banned both in Islam and Christianity. It's, I mean, if you're a real Christian, you should never lend money expecting to make money out of just lending money. You make money by doing real work. Of course, today's capitalism is based on the opposite point of view. But the West invented the Bill of Exchange. The Bill of Exchange was actually a way to circumvent the problem and not be excommunicated by the church. There was a popular theory that started with the philosopher Weber, that Calvinism is a branch of Christianity that sanctifies work. See, Christianity and Islam have a very simple problem. You go to paradise if you believe, basically. If you have faith, that's enough. But what that means is that what you have built during your lifetime doesn't really matter. Now, luckily, there's biology that tells you that you want to leave something to your children. And that's a motivation to do things. But the religion actually encourages you to just have faith. You have to go to church, you have to go to the mosque, you have a good religious person. And Calvinism was a branch of Christianity that instead encouraged practical activities. So Weber said, well, that's the difference. Northern Europe had the Calvinist influence, Southern Italy had the Catholic influence, and you can tell the difference even today. The problem is that capitalism and mercantilism were actually born in Italy first, in those city-states. So that doesn't really work well. In England, that had the Industrial Revolution, was probably the least Protestant country. Germany is where it started. England, for a long time, had the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. And Scotland is Catholic, right? But, you know, probably Protestant moral values are better suited for the capitalist class. I mean, just the Catholic Church never encouraged get rich, be greedy. Greedy is not. I mean, Jesus never said, make a lot of money and keep it to yourself. In fact, Jesus said that everybody goes to paradise except rich people. So the South Catholic Church enforced that idea. The Protestant Church was and is much looser about this idea. Islam, same as the Catholic belief. China, I think I have it on the next slide. China traditionally always looked down on the merchant, trader, what today would call the capitalists. They never had a capitalist. So that could be one reason why they never had an industrial revolution. That there was not the class of the... And historically, the first place where the merchant has a high social status is Florence. Because before that, even with the Romans, the Greek, whatever, that was not a particularly good social status. It was something that was useful, it was appreciated, you would make money, you would buy a villa by the sea, but you wouldn't really be remembered as a great person. Right? Now, then, repeatedly, starting with Mesopotamia, I mentioned that whenever there is chaos, you actually tend to have something good coming out of chaos. And that's not to mean that I encourage anarchy and war. But look at Italy, so fragmented, with all the city-states fighting each other all the time. The French, the Spanish, the Normans, the Arabs, eventually the Austrians invading and so on. Guess what? The Renaissance happened in Italy. And Mesopotamia, I mean, the birthplace of Western civilization, was a bunch of city-states, not a centralized state, it was city-states also fighting each other. And China had Confucius and Lao Tzu at one of the worst times when there was chaos, not when they had the huge, stable, peaceful empire. So sometimes the vacuum of political power is not a bad idea. That's the thing. The vacuum of political power comes at a price. You can see it today around the world. Wherever there is a vacuum of political power, you have wars. That's always been the case. When the Romans exterminated all their enemies, they had peace. 2 centuries of peace. When the Mongols conquered all the big area, there was a century of peace. When there's a political vacuum, then you have wars. And when you have a political vacuum, one advantage, so the disadvantage is obvious. The advantage is that there's no ruling class that decides what we do tomorrow morning. The merchants have more freedom. And one reason why the first commercial revolution happened in Italy is precisely because there was no French king saying, I am the economy. You give money to me and I decide how to spend it. And in those days, typically the kings would spend it in the army, in warfare. In Italy, this was much weaker. And so, because of the chaos, actually, because of the chaos. The other thing that we don't like to mention is that, so in places where there's political vacuum, what you have is a separation of politics and economy. That's one thing. Otherwise, if the state is very strong, Soviet Union, communism, same thing. Politics and economy are the same thing. It's all centralized, okay? United States, the government traditionally has not decided micro decided the economy. So that's still true today. The more centralized power is, the more constrained the economy is. The vacuum, unfortunately, anarchy, chaos, warfare, but actually you decouple politics and economics. What's the other thing I wanted to say? Oh yeah, and competition. That's the other thing, that we don't really like to say this, but the European countries became really good at warfare because they were fighting each other all the time. And eventually, when they went to Asia, first they arrived in India and then in China, they found countries, huge empires, they were not prepared to fight a war. But the Europeans had been fighting for 2, 3, 4 centuries non-stop. 1945 is a very important date in Europe. That's when the wars ended. I mean, France and Germany and Britain have not fought a war since 1945. That never happened in the previous 1,000 years. There was always a war in Europe, always. Most of them are not even recorded because there's so many, you only recorded the big ones. You know? But the advantage of fighting wars all the time is that you get really, really good at using gunpowder, making cannons and warships and so on. Okay, I think this is already said. So instability could be one reason. And even the United States, eventually the United States becomes the wealthiest and most powerful country in the West, right? Well, but think of it. There was a civil war. 3 presidents were assassinated. Widespread corruption. As the United States at the end of the 19th century, there was all these big barons and mafia running cities, city bosses. Financial crashes, one after the other. Most famous in 1929, but there were others before. And all the time, every time there's financial panic. There were workers' strikes, as you know, there was communism, fear of communism, what was it called? The Red Scare? Yeah, of course, the Indian Wars. Hundreds of thousands of people were exterminated, and things like the Ku Klux Klan. So this is the country that became the world superpower. Now, if I put here China, I don't know, Han Song, the Song dynasty, it would be, scholars. It would be the equivalent of the defense minister was actually a great poet and calligrapher, So, So it's not trivial to say. So what fosters innovation? Like it or not, political chaos, warfare, greed, cultural risk, and cultural exploration. Those are 5 things that you keep finding in history. And again, I'm not recommending we do it again, but if you look at where you had innovation in society, actually that's what has happened a lot of times. And opposing innovation, the more centralized the state is, the slower the country tends to go. France at one point was leading in Europe, and then it lost to Britain. And that was when Britain had the Glorious Revolution and all the things that the confiscation of the monasteries, land. So while Britain was being decentralized, France was getting very centralized. The Sun King and so on. And guess what? A couple of centuries later, Britain as the biggest empire in the world, France has remained an agricultural country. So you kept seeing that over and over. As I said, Soviet Union, the United States, same thing. Soviet Union much more centralized. Then of course, the countries that have caste, whatever you want to call them, aristocracy, whatever, that usually does not foster innovation. Religion has traditionally not been a force for innovation. It's a force for conserving values. And actually peace. Whenever you have peace, Romans had 2 centuries of peace. They had everything that Britain had later, but the Romans never thought of having an industrial revolution. And China didn't have an industrial revolution. Kept inventing things, but didn't have it. So that's obviously, this is provocative, but it's to show you that actually periods of chaos, very often are the periods that gave us the world as it is today. Is that good or bad? That's a different story, okay? I think one reason why religion was invented is actually to protect people from all of this. Because number one is to be able to provide for your family today, send children to school and be safe, So I'm not advocating that we should have this all the time. But indirectly, if you think of Silicon Valley is doing this without guns. But you have chaos. Think of the startups, think of high tech, okay? Don't think of armies. We have warfare, constant competition. Of course, greed is a big motivation. Cultural risk and cultural exploration. Trying to. So you can create those same conditions without killing millions of people. Anyway, if you have better explanation of why the West, you're welcome to. So anyway, this is the list of all the places where you have chaos, and guess what? Something bigger happens. So writing is invented, Confucius, Aristotle, Plato, so on and so on. These are all cases where there was chaos, and actually we saw big ideas came out. Okay, so that's sort of trivia. So at this point, you have to wonder, why the West? Given all the bad things that we said about the West, all the good things that we said about everything else, given that all the great ideas came from the East, from the invention of writing, to Jesus, to Buddha, to mathematics, to whatever. Why the West? Okay. So lots of books have been written, by the way. So don't take this as the final words. Questions before I start with the 20th century?
So one of the key takeaways that you could emphasize is that innovation wasn't driven by science. It was more like there was innovation, and then science was there to study it and figure out, well, how does that work?
Exactly.
But thought and science and mathematics are more theoretical things. Like when you look at the Greeks, it wasn't because someone had invented something. They still were very much, they moved the thought needle without inventions. So why were they thinkers, and why were subsequent generations doers more so?
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to the second one, but you have a good point indirectly. Physics, the scientific revolution, is really a child of philosophy. It's really a process that starts with the Greeks trying to figure out what is the universe, what makes the universe move, okay, these fundamental things. And then as you keep thinking and thinking, of course you also observe what is going on. The microscope, the telescope were very important in understanding how the universe works. But it's still a theoretical thing, And innovation comes from very practical things. Why in the Middle Ages they invented the reading glasses? Probably because those city-states needed people to be productive even in the old age. There was suddenly a need for something, and somebody came up with that thing that the Romans didn't need because they had slaves to run the economy. So those were two different parallel lines, where you have thought. It starts with the Thales in Greece, and it's just speculation. But that speculation gets narrower and narrower because the telescope, the microscope, and simple experiments on Earth, Newton's apple, tell you, well, that is not possible, that is not possible. So you start, and eventually you get to Newton's equations and so on. And the technology really evolved until this point. Technology is evolving just because people needed things. People need to pump water out of the coal mine. Why they need coal? Well, that's because of the textile industry. One thing, the second industrial revolution last evening when I talked about the United States is typical. One need triggered one boom that triggered another need that triggered another boom, and you go on and go on. There's no science there. Science comes later. Science then explains why things work the way they work. So it is a good point. And this will remain true for a long time, because even if you think today, what's the impact on technology of the Big Bang theory, or quarks, or most of these things actually haven't had a practical application. There's more and more, we'll see tonight, that actually science does become very important, especially chemistry and electricity, of course, electromagnetism. Those formulas eventually give us products. Most of the things in this room exist because of science, actually. I'll have a slide soon. So, from the political point of view, the modern age starts with some big events. There's 3 revolutions, actually. The Russian Revolution, Russia becomes a communist country. It was the most backwards country in Europe, of the big ones, in terms of literacy, in terms of just the system. They still had basically slavery. It was called serfdom, but that's what it was. They had the Tsar, the absolutist monarch. So it was backwards. Although the revolution happened, as it is often the case, just when it was changing, and it was actually giving us great writers. Anyway, Russia becomes communist. Now that's funny, because Marx thought communism is the unavoidable next stage of capitalism. He thought that Germany and Britain and the United States would become communist first. Communism instead will succeed in Russia and then in China, North Korea, Cuba, whatever. But in the countries that are least developed, which is kind of ironic. Then Mussolini started the fascist party, and one of the bad inventions come out of Italy. Italy has a tradition of pioneering bad inventions. Mafia, Mussolini, Berlusconi. So Mussolini invented the fascism, and Hitler. He was probably influenced by Lenin, but anyway, Hitler would definitely be influenced by Mussolini. It's still a mystery today why Hitler thought Mussolini was such a great man. Mussolini is one of the reasons why Hitler lost the war. And eventually, you know the story, eventually we have World War II. In between, things happen, but those are the 3 big ones, unfortunately. The new isms: communism, fascism, and Nazism. And I don't want to get into too many details, but I think probably you know the story. Lenin starts the revolution. It's a long story. The revolution started against the Tsars, but then there was basically a coup. The revolution that they celebrated was really the coup that came after the elections. And what everybody remembers was the mass extermination of their own citizens. Hitler did not exterminate its own citizens. Different kind of extermination. In Russia, there's even funny stories. Lenin at some point sent a telegram that said, I think it said, we are not shooting enough teachers, something like that, because things were not happening the way he wanted. So his solution was, let's shoot just a lot of people, so we will force the survivors to do what we want. And when at the end of World War II, when hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, prisoners of wars, were returning to Russia, Stalin ordered all of them killed or deported to the gulags. Some of them were heroes, but he didn't want that. Some of them could have been traitors. He didn't want the traitors to escape. So to make sure that no guilty person gets out of it, he took all of them and either killed them, had them shot, or sent to the gulags. So the story of communism is really weird. But the big thing is Russia wanted to assert itself, that people liked communists the way they like Putin now. You know, it's a way for Russians to actually be protagonists finally, instead of just being this backwards land in the East. Okay, Hitler, it's a simpler story. It's probably the puzzling thing is why Germans believed in this guy, but there was really no major ideological thing behind it. It was just this obsession with the pure race. And of course, his biggest termination will be of other people, not only Jews, but Poles, Russians. Actually, Russians were the main victims. Mein Kampf is a very good read, actually. It shouldn't be forbidden, because it has these sentences that I think a lot of politicians still use. Like, the size of the lie is a factor in causing it to believe. The bigger the lie, the more likely people will believe it. Some of these things are used, in my opinion, by today's politicians. Anyway, so that's what is happening in Europe. Germany, after World War I, has lost the war, but actually this guy, Hitler, is rebuilding. And Hitler did rebuild the economy. Germany was extremely poor after World War I. Hitler rebuilt the economy. It's one reason why Germans believe in Hitler.
Was he an entrepreneur? Like, how did he do it? Is he just a politician from a young age? I don't know his story.
Maybe Germany would have done it anyway. It had a very weak government for a while. Hitler was a strong government, gave enough stability to the country. Maybe it would have happened anyway. We don't know. No major breakthrough. It just probably gave confidence to the country. But it stopped hyperinflation, and it started an industrial boom.
Yeah, I just wonder what was it about those countries that allowed such a domineering leader.
Yeah, well, when these people, when they seized power, they all seized power pseudo-democratically. Lenin lost the election, but he was close enough to winning it that he could claim, I won the election. Then there was a civil war. In the civil war, millions of people were killed. So in that case, they had to believe communism. You know, it became a ferocious dictatorship. Hitler won 30-something% of the vote. It was the largest party, so it was voted in power by Germans. The Germans who voted Hitler didn't want to kill Jews. They wanted a strong leader. They believed in Hitler. Once he was in power, again, you could not argue against it. And Mussolini did the same in Italy. Mussolini also did good things for the economy in Italy. The land north of Rome, between Rome and Florence, was swamps with malaria. And Mussolini is the one who cleaned them. So when you're a dictator, you can do things. It's the United States. I mean, this gridlock in Congress all the time. Then compare with China, one bullet train a week. You know, it's new skyscrapers every day. The difference is obvious. When you have a dictatorship, you can have things